Validation controls work on both the client and the server. On the client side, well, that support only works if the browser supports it, but these days, pretty much every browser supports DHTML, that's dynamic HTML, and JavaScript. If any control's data is invalid, the client-side scripting keeps the page from posting back, so it doesn't even make a round trip if the validation controls verify that the data isn't valid. There's also server-side code that always performs validation checks after submission. This verifies that spoofing the client-side code won't bypass the validation. So you have validation code on the server side and on the client side using these controls. The controls are created on the server as the page is rendered, and they output HTML and script to the client side. They don't necessarily display anything in the browser at all, unless the input fields fail to validate. For each validation control, you need to set at least two properties. There's the control to validate. That's a reference to the control that you need to validate. And there's an error message property, which is the text to be displayed if the control fails validation. You'll also want to look at the enable client script property. This allows you to disable client-side validations if you want all the validations to be performed on the server side. There are a number of different validation controls, including the required field validator, which ensures that any required field has been filled in. It actually ensures that for the required field, the value the user types is different than the default value of the control. So you can put in a default value and force them to change it to something else. There's a range validator that checks that a user's entry falls within a specified range of values, and you can specify what kind of values, numbers, dates, and so on. There's a compare validator control, which compares a user's entry against another value, or a constant, or a control, or a value in a database. This is useful, for example, where you want to ask the user to enter, say, an email address, and you want to have a second text box where they enter it again, and then you compare them to make sure they're the same before you allow the data to be treated as valid. There's a regular expression validator, which checks that an entry matches a pattern, which is defined as a regular expression. There's a custom validator that allows you to supply your own custom logic to verify that the data that has been entered is valid. You have to write some code to use this control. And there's the validation summary control, which displays a summary of all the error messages for the validation controls on the page. Each validation control performs a single test. Now, what happens if you need to check for multiple validations? Then you can associate multiple validators with a single control on the same page. Remember that each validator control has a control to validate property, and they can each point to the same control to be validated. Multiple tests are resolved using the AND operator, so that if any of the validations don't pass, the entire control isn't valid. They all have to pass, or the control won't validate. Well, how can you tell if a page is valid? If client-side validation is available, each validation control causes validation immediately upon entering a value. Each validation control exposes an isValid property, so you know if each control is valid or not. The page exposes an isValid property as well. It just ANDs together all the control isValid properties, and when they're all true, the page's isValid property is true as well. This doesn't take into account validation groups, which we'll look at in the next section. The required field validator control verifies that you've entered something into the control. But actually, let's make this clear. This control validates that what you've entered is different than the default value of the control. By default, the default value is an empty string, which forces you to enter something. But you can set the default value to be something besides an empty string, forcing the user to enter something else into the control you're validating. It has properties like the control to validate. The error message, that's what gets displayed if there's an error. There's the for color, which is the color you display the error message in, and there's the text. That's what displays within the body of the control itself. Adding the required field validator and setting its properties adds markup to your page. It ends up looking something like this. It adds properties and settings for the control. You get the error message, you get the control to validate, and so on. Just like any other control, adding a required field validator or any other validator just ends up adding markup for you. And supply an initial value, prompting for input that has to be replaced. Just set the initial value property of the validator, and if the value to be validated is the same as the initial value, the validation fails. And as I mentioned before, the default value of that initial value property is an empty string. Now, where does this all happen? Required field validators only validate when you submit the page. It wouldn't make much sense to check for existence as you leave each control. It would really get in the way. So there's really no client-side behavior for the required field validator. And for all the validators, you may want them to take up no space unless they're currently active. There's a display property that controls the display behavior, and you can set this to one of three options. Dynamic, which says only display if you have to, static, which means always display, and none, which means never display. Well, let's take a look at our example using the required field validator. The sample project is named Validation Controls, and within this I'll open the default.aspx page. Now this page has a lot of information on it, so disregard stuff we're not talking about yet. But there are several controls whose value must be set. There's the title of courtesy, first name, last name, and birth date all need to be filled in before we can submit this page. Now, how does that work? Well, let's see what happens if we attempt to submit the page without supplying those values. Well, I can certainly tab through the controls without setting those values so that we know the required field validator isn't doing anything on the client side. I click Submit, and a number of things happens. We'll talk more about this dialog box later. But you can see that both asterisks appear, and down here, some summary information appears. Clearly, that's the validation summary control, which we'll look at later on. But you can see that we were not able to submit the page successfully because we attempted to submit it without filling in those values. Let's enter some information, like a first name and a last name, and notice that although we didn't validate, it does check to see that it's empty, and it removes the asterisk without making a round trip as I enter data into that control. So the asterisk won't appear until we submit, but once we do submit, it knows there should be data, and it does display the asterisk once we've attempted to submit the page. Now with these values filled in, click Submit, and now we only get one error. There's one control left that has a value that needs to be filled in. We still can't submit the page, but at least we've gotten farther. Let's close the page and look at its properties in Design View. Well, clearly with this thing right here, this control must be the required field validator, and this one, and this one, and so on. Let's look at the properties of these controls. There are a number of different properties you'll want to set, including the control to validate. You have to set that property, or the control can't do its job. There it is. We've set the control to validate. An error message, that controls what displays in the validation summary if the validation fails. There's a text property. That's what shows up within the body of the control itself if the control is visible. You can also set the forecolor property if you like. Where is that? There it is. To be something that controls the display of the control when it becomes visible. There's also this display property, which controls how the validator is displayed. Mine is set to static, so it always shows up. It still takes up space, even when it isn't showing its text property. You could set that to dynamic if you wanted to place some other control maybe next to it, and then it wouldn't take up space on the page unless it was actually showing its text property. How about the initial value property? Well, that one right now is set to an empty string. Let me go to first name here, set its validation property. There we go. Set its validation control's initial value property to be something like enter your name. So the way it works is, unless we enter something other than enter your name, it won't validate. It doesn't make much sense to have that value unless you also set the text property of the text box to be that value. There we go. So now, apparently we've got some font issue here. Let's go set the font. Well, we'll try it out. Doesn't really seem to be right. We'll give it a run though. Let's run the page in the browser. Well, it's still not looking great, but you get my point here. If we try to submit this, look at that. There's some extra spaces. Since it doesn't match the default, there's no problem. There we go. Since it exactly matches the default value, it's saying, hey, wait a second. You didn't modify the default, so you need to enter something here besides enter your name. If I change that to anything else, it validates just fine. So you can enter an initial value property and force the user to enter something else if that's the behavior you need. I'm not sure how I got those extra spaces there, but clearly somebody thinks they're there. Okay, so we talked about the display property, and this only really has an effect if you place something next to the control. So here, for example, let's place a text box or a button, say, right next to that control. Now, if we run this as it is, let's run this in a browser. The button always appears spaced farther to the right because there's room here for that validation control. Let's come back in, find that control, there it is, bring up its properties, and set its display property to be dynamic. And now run the page again. And now you notice it's closer in. I left a little extra space, but because that control hasn't yet displayed its validation problem, we don't see that extra space taken up. If I click Submit, the button moves over to make room for that validation control. If I enter a value, the button moves back to fill in the space that was used by the text of the validation control. Now you've seen a number of different properties that the validation control uses. I'm going to clean this back up to the way it was. Almost all of the other validation controls make use of the same properties you've seen so far. They each add their own set of properties in addition to those you've seen for the required field validator. So as we look at other validators, we won't discuss those same properties again. We'll look at properties that are specific for each validator control. The range validator control ensures that data falls within a range of values. You supply the minimum value, the maximum value, and the most important property is the type. You need to specify what kind of value you're checking the range of: currency, double, integer, date, or string. Because if you want to enter a date between January 1st and January 30th, but you've set the type to be string, it's very difficult to get the range of dates right in that case. We're going to try looking at the days per week setting on the sample page, which needs to be a number between 0 and 7. The days per week control has a validator, which is a range validator. I'll bring up its properties. And this one validates txt days per week. That's this text box. There are a number of different properties you must set. Obviously, the error message and the text. But the real important ones are minimum value, maximum value, and type. Here on type, we can select any of the options you've seen. This has to be an integer between 0 and 7. So let's give it a try. on days per week, well, there's no required field validator, so I don't have to specify a value. But if I do enter a value, it's got to be an integer, and it must be between 0 and 7. If I enter 8, for example, and let's fill in everything else so we don't get any validation errors. We have enter a valid employee birthday. Well, there's a reason for this. We'll look at that validator later, but the employee has to be 18 years old, so that didn't pass. And we need to enter a number between 1 and 7. Well, that's pretty irritating, isn't it? Look at that. Not only did we get caught on the wrong validator, but somehow the properties are set wrong. Minimum value is 0, max value is 7, but the error message says enter a number between 1 and 7. Don't fall into that trap. Make sure you get that right. Well, actually, I'll leave the error message alone and change the minimum value, because clearly that's what I want to enter. So now, if we try it again, I'll enter the required fields, enter a birth date that makes me at least 18, and enter days per week of 7, and that's fine. We submit, no problems. If I change this to be A, again, we can't make that work because we didn't enter a number between 1 and 7. The interesting thing is, if I change this to 7 and tab out, it knows right away. So there is some client-side behavior checking this out. Let me see what happens if I shut this down, come back in, view it in the browser, and never submit this, but enter an invalid value in here. If I just tab out, it immediately knows that there's a problem. It didn't perform a round trip. There was client-side code that determined that this days per week value is invalid. If I enter 4 and tab out, everything's fine. So it's doing the verification on the client side, and of course if I do attempt to submit, at that point it's also doing, this actually never even made it to the server because the required field validator at the time we attempt to submit failed. But we would perform server-side validation as well if it actually got back to the server. You can use the compare validator control to compare to another value. Perhaps in another control, perhaps in a literal value. In our sample, the hire date must be a later date than the birth date. I mean, really, can you be hired before you were born? Probably not. You need to specify some particular properties. Obviously, the control to compare. You also need to specify the value to compare. And the operator, which can be a data type check, which means you're only checking that the data types are the same. Then there's equal, greater than equal, less than equal, and not equal. The data type check is interesting because you can use the compare validator then just to make sure that two values are of the same data type. Now, you don't want to set both the control to compare and the value to compare properties. If you do, the control to compare will win if you manage to set both of them. So make sure you just set one of the two properties. If you want to compare data types, set the data type check compare option. It won't bother comparing values, it will just compare data types. Let's look at an example that checks to ensure that the hire date value is greater than the birth date value. The validation control for hire date is a compare validator. If I press F4, we'll see the properties of that compare validator. You can see that we have to set control to validate here, which is txt hire date. We've also set the control to compare, which is txt birth date. We want to make sure that this control compares to txt birth date, and what's the operator? Has to be greater than. If you choose anything other than data type check, you compare the data type and the value. If you choose data type check, you only compare the data type. In this case, we're checking both the data type and that this value is greater than the birth date. We have to also specify the type. I didn't mention that because we used it in the previous demonstration. but you also must select what kind of value you're comparing. In this case, it's a date. Imagine you didn't specify this. They wouldn't know how to parse the input data, and in this case, by using a date, they can use regional information to make it possible to parse the date correctly. So that's all we have to look at, so let's view in the browser. Of course, I have to specify all these things, and the birth date. Got to be 18, right? So I'll choose 1960. And if I put a higher date that's less than that, I've been a very long-term and loyal employee. If I press Tab, it tells me right away that that is not a valid date. If I attempt to submit, of course, we see the higher date must be greater than the birth date. If we enter something that is greater than the birth date, press Tab, all is well. We're doing that comparison on the client side, and we never had to make a round trip to verify that that data was correct. If I enter data of the wrong type, we get the same error. That is, higher date. Well, it's not a very useful error, but at least it tells us that it's not the correct kind of thing. If we leave it empty, well, no one said we had to supply a value. So if we don't supply a value, it validates just fine. Before we leave this portion of the demonstration, I want to look at what's actually going on within the browser, because there's got to be some JavaScript code running, right, for this to happen? Well, let's look at the source. If we view the source, first of all, we find a whole lot of JavaScript code. That's the HTML. But down here is all this JavaScript code that got injected by all of our validation controls to do the work of validating what's going on the page. We're not going to examine the JavaScript code. You can if you like. But there's a bunch of code that's imported from a Microsoft-supplied JavaScript file. So all the validation procedures are stored elsewhere, and they're downloaded as necessary to your local machine. But you can see down here that when we place these validation controls on the page, we also inject a large amount of JavaScript code that runs on the client side to perform the validation for you. I just wanted to make sure you understood that there was no magic here. It's either got to run on the server or the client. And if it's running on the client side, there has to be JavaScript code that's injected into the page by ASP.NET as it renders the page and sends it to the browser.